Everyone, and welcome to today's webcast. Today we are discussing, as you know, because you signed up, careers, family, gender, workplace dynamics as it relates to the not only the human resource function in an organization, but also for leadership and management in general. Today we're going to be talking about all this with Pamela Tolbert from the ILR School at Cornell. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Real quick, a couple notes here. If you haven't opened up your chat window, to the top right of the screen there, you will see a little quote bubble where you can open up the chat and then issue us some questions. So we're going to be looking at questions in real time. So you can submit your questions as they come up, and we'll either hit them during the conversation or at the end when we do a little Q&A. So thanks all for joining us. One last note is that we have a quiz for those of you who are interested in earning continuing education unit credits. You can stick around after class. We have a quick 4-question quiz where if you pay any attention at all and you've kind of engaged with today's presentation, you should do just fine. We're not in the business of stumping people or providing over-rigorous quizzes. So Pamela, thanks for coming again. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do at the ILR School. I know you're Director of Graduate Studies, you're a professor, lecturer. Tell us about your work as it relates to what we're doing today.
Okay, so I've been at ILR for quite a long time. I came from, I did my degree at UCLA in sociology, and so my interest sort of reflects that background. I'm interested in the connection between organizations and society and how social changes affect organizations, and organizations can affect social changes in the world.
We were talking a little bit about, and I didn't want to get too deep into it, organizational behavior just as a concept we were talking about. It's essentially management, but there is sociology and psychology involved in a lot of your work.
Oh, absolutely. Organizational behavior was a sort of field that emerged out of both psychology and sociology, and from people in both fields who are interested in studying organizations, organizational phenomena, important part of social life. So some people specialized in that, and the work covers a range of issues from kind of individual perception and motivation to structuring organizations and spread of practices across organizations, that sort of thing.
So that's pretty broad, but I think one of the through lines to today's conversation, the thing we're going to be talking about is work-life balance.
Right, right.
Why is that an issue today? What's the landscape look like? Give us some perspective on that.
So this gets into how organizations affect social life in part. Yeah. And I think there are a couple of things that have led to this becoming a really big issue today, particularly. I mean, people have always worked, people have always had families, but there have been changes in both families and the workplace, particularly since the 1970s, that have kind of led to a perfect storm in how these two spheres relate to each other.
What was happening in the 70s?
Well, you begin to, in the 1970s, an increasing number of women went to work full time. Yeah. So we moved from the kind of traditional family where you have the husband is the breadwinner and the wife stays at home and takes care of things, to a place where you have dual earner couples are, commonplace. And that change occurred pretty quickly, actually. Back in the 1970s, I think, I've forgotten the exact statistics, but about 50% of all families, the husband worked, the wife stayed at home. By the 2000, it was somewhere between 60% to 75% of the workforce were dual earners, both members of the family in the workforce, and oftentimes both in the workforce full time. So that meant that there was just more pressure on the family because more time is being spent at work. Who's going to stay at home to feed the kids and walk the dog and be there when the plumber comes and all of that. So the stresses that came because of those kinds of changes were huge, and they affect obviously both men as well as women because you've got dual earner families. It's important to get the income from both members of the family. And so there's not a lot of flex oftentimes, and then the workplace really didn't change that much. You have this big social change going on outside the workplace that affects it. Not so much adaptation. And actually, some of the changes that have taken place at work are actually making the conflict even worse. So we've had the rise of what they call long hours workers, people who work 50 or more hours a week.
Right.
Obviously, that's going to make things much, much worse. I mean, that, when you think about it, if you're working 50 hours a week, 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, then that means you're at work for 10 hours a day, but then there's also maybe a 45-minute commute to and from, and then half an hour for lunch. So that means people are leaving at 7 in the morning and not getting home till after 7 at night. So
Right.
how do you manage the rest of your life?
In a partnership, in a parental capacity, everything pretty much
And
is stressed.
It's not just families. If you're a single person, you're still faced with trying, who's going to be there when the cable company comes, or, you've got a plumbing problem.
Yeah.
So it affects everybody in the workplace, these kinds of changes.
I want to take a look at we have something called the metric of the moment, where it describes some of the trends you have just identified there. What we do, or what we see in this bit of research is this is from a Pew study. Here we go. So we're looking at the rise in dual income families with children under 18 has risen from 49% in 1970, right, to 66% in 2015. There's some suggestion that the number is rising. I think it.
So I think it peaked around 2010.
Yeah, it looks like it does in this
and
graphic
it may
here.
have actually dropped slightly, but
Okay.
it's the majority of people are in dual earner majority of families are dual earners.
Right, and then we've got the only father employed and only mother employed stats, right? Only father employed 28%, so that's close to that 25%.
Back in the old days.
Back in the old days, and only mother employed is about 4% currently, right? So I thought that was kind of compelling and interesting to look at, and I don't think it's too much of a surprise, but what we do observe there are trends happening.
Oh, yeah.
And they're continuing to go in a particular direction.
Right. So that basically almost everybody's in the workforce all the time. That's the trend.
Exactly. So do you want to, okay, here we go. So you had talked about the workplace is actually adapting to these trends and what that means for the work itself and the experience, I suppose.
To some extent, the workplace is adapting. Sometimes it's maladapting. Like I said, there's been the rise of the long hours work. But firms have obviously had to cope with the fact that their employees have lives too. And there are a number of things that some firms, not all firms, have done to try and help deal with these problems. And that includes things like providing leaves for families, for both medical care as well as childcare, trying to adapt, making flexible work arrangements in some cases, and some probably the other, less common is providing childcare assistance or support to families.
I was wondering to what degree that actually happens in America. It's like, is this
childcare support?
Yeah. I know that in extremely forward-thinking companies, right? This is certainly the case.
There are some notable cases in point. So there's Campbell Soup Company has an on-site daycare center, and it's very generous. SAS Corporation, the data analysis company, also has childcare support. They have medical care. They have all kinds of things to help. I mean, SAS is actually a great case analysis because they're one of the few companies in the world today that, in the U.S. anyway, who shoot for a 35-hour work week.
Okay.
And in tech services, that's incredibly uncommon.
That's right. So federally, there's a 40-hour mandate or something like that, but company policy pulls it back to 35.
Right. Well, there's actually not a mandate. The idea is that if you work 40 hours a week, if you work more than 40 hours a week, you get paid overtime, but only if you are, I always get this confused, non-exempt, I think, or that is, so if you are a full-time manager or professional, you can, your employer can ask you to work more than 40 hours a week without having to pay you overtime, which is part of the reason we have these really long hour workers now. So it's only the people who are paid on an hourly basis who typically get overtime pay.
An audience member just chimed in and asked me to move the microphone closer to you, or we can watch that level there, Dominic. Thank you.
Okay.
Should become clear any moment.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Perfect.
Good to know.
Well, let's touch on the other two really quickly. So flexible work is obviously something that some of us enjoy, some don't. What's the trend going on with that?
Yeah.
Why would companies do it or not, right? What's the case for and against, especially if you're an HR practitioner, right, out there working and dealing
Right.
with either making the transition to or retreating from?
Yeah. So a lot of companies have some degree of flexible work arrangements available, and that includes things like being able to change your start hours or stop hours. It also includes being able to work at home sometimes. So a lot of particularly larger companies do make these kind of arrangements available. I think like 3/4 of employers who have more than 50 people allow for this kind of flexible start-stop time schedules, and nearly 2/3 allow some employees to work at home. But the kicker is, the thing that makes this difficult is actually implementing it. So it's
Right.
easy to put the policy in place. Most places require that your supervisor sign off. If you as an individual want to change your schedule,
Yeah.
your supervisor has to approve, right?
Okay, yeah.
And that's where things get kind of tricky, because there's a lot of evidence that there's huge variation among supervisors in their willingness to do so. And you can understand that.
Of course, everyone's got a different style and a way of doing things.
And if you're a supervisor, if you're letting people change their schedules around, then you've got to move all the other pieces around, get other people's schedules to arrange, and you've got to make sure or face the fact that you might be understaffed. And there's also just the kind of nervousness about, well, if you're not here and I can't see you, how do I know you're really working?
Yeah.
I mean, that's deeply ingrained in our kind of psyche in terms of thinking about work. So for all those reasons, there's often a lot of even if a company has these policies in place, there's a lot of variance across the supervisors, which then means that can actually create a sense of inequity. If I'm an employee in one department and my supervisor won't let me do it, and I see that somebody else is, in some way, I wouldn't say it makes things worse, but it certainly adds a different kind of problem.
And there's an underlying business thing going on here, which is, in order to attract top talent, you've got to be an organization that actually does provide flexible work, given that everyone needs to live in, or dual income households are much more common than they are not. So that's how you get the talent, right? And then it's just a matter of figuring out how to make that work.
So, right. So I've seen surveys that suggest nearly 90% of people who are employed or want to look for, are looking for jobs, say that having these kind of arrangements is incredibly important to them. It's very important.
Yes.
And so organizations offer them, but it's the implementation where things get difficult. Logically it makes sense, but you still have to somehow coordinate schedules with people and get them to, do the production. So even though they're widespread, they're not necessarily widely used. There's also another issue that research has suggested in terms of that, which is there's some work that suggests that people who aren't at work, aren't around all the time, are more likely to be penalized in terms of promotions, so the companies make them available, but people are a little worried about using them for fear that that's going to actually have an adverse effect on their career.
Hey, can we talk about the ideal worker? That's the concept that they were kind of kicking around, because let's talk about what that looks like, because for some people there's this imaginary ideal worker.
Right. So that's kind of the genesis of the problem, in a sense that I think a lot of the current work arrangements are built on this notion of what you call an ideal worker, what people refer to as an ideal worker. And that's, essentially somebody who is available to work every day from 9 to 5 or more, who is unencumbered by any kind of constraints, presumably because they have someone at home. And this goes back to the old notion that you have this traditional family where the husband works and the wife stays at home and takes care of things, which some people have argued. Actually, there's an economist, Gary Becker, who argued that that's actually, it yields the best outcomes for families to have people specialize.
I kept reading that before we did this. I was doing research, and there was a strong economic cases for this
Yeah.
doing it this way.
Right. So which, it makes sense to up to a point, as long as nobody dies, nobody gets divorced.
Right.
And men are happy not to be at home with their families, and wives are happy to do all of the childcare stuff, and they're not worried about being dependent. So, so the economic argument is that when you specialize in work or family, then you get really efficient at doing whatever it is you do. But I think there are lots and lots of caveats about potential problems that can create for families, down the road.
So we hit the flexible part. Can we talk a little bit about family leave and everything that's involved in that?
Yeah, okay. So that's another common way of trying to help people cope with the work-family demands.
Okay.
We finally got legislation to mandate it. We were one of the last countries in the world.
What year was that?
Western. The
90s?
family medical leave, it was somewhere in the 90s.
Bill Clinton era, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it is not exactly generous. It allows people to take up to 12 weeks off for family or medical care. It also, but the other restriction, so unpaid, that's an important caveat.
Right, that's
unpaid.
right. Yep.
And you have to have worked at a place for a year, and it's only applicable to employers who have 50 or more employees. So that means that a large proportion of the workforce isn't affected by it. I think it's like slightly under half, almost half of the workforce, because they either work in small employers or they haven't been there for a year, or the other kind of restrictions. So
what can HR do to augment that from an internal policy standpoint?
Right.
What do companies do?
So the alternative is for companies to step up and provide leave policies, which a lot of, again, larger corporations have done this.
What do they look like? We're talking about 12 weeks.
Yeah. So there's a lot of variation. Many of them provide paid leave for 8 weeks or more. And they can, the thing is, one of the important things is that employers can't fire you for taking this leave. That's one of the guarantees.
Okay.
Well, that's a good thing.
Of course it is.
If you're
it's
up
still
against
savage.
if you're up against the wall,
Yes, right.
It's nice to know that there's a little protection if you have to take a leave.
Yeah.
But again, you run into the problem that oftentimes in companies the leaves are not available to all employees. It's often they're often targeted to professional or managerial employees, because that's who firms really care about keeping. The employees that are most important to the company.
Sure.
And again, you run into this kind of stigmatizing effect when people actually use them. There is research that shows women who have taken leaves have had slower wage growth or less likely to be promoted. Although the one thing that I thought was interesting is that if you leave the company, so take your leave and leave the company, then your wage growth goes back up, which is not good for the employers. Obviously, that's kind
of course.
Stymieing them. So there. It's helpful, and it's good that employers are trying to do these kinds of things. But there are often some problems with that. As it turns
paternal
out.
leave? I'm sure that's probably equally as stigmatized, if not.
Yeah,
maybe a little bit
absolutely.
More,
the research suggests that both men and women are often get wage penalties and promotions if they take leaves of absence. And the irony is that some of the companies that have the most generous policies, like in the financial services firms or law firms, that's the place where people are the least likely to take them for fear that they're going to be penalized in their careers. So it's it's a dilemma, and HR can't. They can make the policies available, but it's the promotions and the compensation decisions are not made by HR. It's made by the managers who are looking and thinking, "Gosh, I haven't seen you around." Sorry.
Right.
And if you're not here, you can't have been that productive. You know, there's always the assumption that if I can't see you, you're not working. Or the counterpart is, if I can see you, you are being productive, which of course is
Right.
equally problematic, perhaps.
Sure, especially with a remote force, virtual team type stuff. So, I did want to encourage the audience to chime in with any questions here. I'm looking at the iPad, so if you want to kick anything over to us, I think this next segment is going to be particularly interesting, and I think some questions might come up during this. But so let's talk about solutions to some of these problems. We've got the flexible work component. We've got not very generous from painting with a broad brush, leave policies.
Sometimes hard to use, I would say, leave policies.
What do you mean hard to use?
Oh, I just meant in terms of the kind of, like I was describing, the career problems and things like that.
Right. And then we have the childcare component in a dual income household. There's so many things going on. Did we touch on childcare enough? I mean...
Well, I think that it's interesting because that was actually a solution that was promoted a lot more. I saw back in the 80s. And I see less and less of that in the practitioner literature. It is providing on-site care is very expensive, and there's all kinds of licensing and things like that. So I think less than 10% of large companies.
I think some companies are offering, and I think this is, I don't know, maybe this is becoming more common, which is something akin to a flexible spending account that can be used for childcare. That's a pretty cool solution.
That's very common, and it's very useful in terms of your taxes. Because you basically don't have to pay. It's income that you would receive that's not taxed, and that is very useful. But it doesn't help you find a childcare provider, or if your child is sick, how do you manage that? So, and some organizations used to, I don't know how many still do, provide referrals to childcare providers.
Yep.
But I see that less and less, and I don't know whether there are liability issues involved, like if you recommend a childcare provider. I'm not sure, but it seems to me that this is a kind of declining area of interest in a lot of the HR world.
Oh, that's disappointing. So, I thought we were going to go somewhere with that, but
lots of ideas bubbling around, but it turns out they're often hard to execute.
So here's the part that I'm kind of excited about. We've covered the historical and the present day, and without getting prescriptive, I don't think we're going to go to that direction, but I'm curious what companies are doing, right? So there's some. We had talked a little bit before this about companies rethinking the way that work actually gets done.
Right.
So this is exciting, not only just to talk about, but I think for the HR practitioner to get some fresh ideas and spark some thoughts.
So there are a couple of major experiments in particular that I think are really promising, and part of the thing that makes them, I think, work is that they're really focused on rethinking how we work, not just trying to help people manage work-family relations, but the basic premise. These are a couple of experiments, one that was done at Best Buy and another at the Boston Consulting Group.
Both similar programs?
Similar in many ways.
What happened at Best Buy?
So the idea is that it's not just we need to help people. We need to really think about how we can work smarter in order to be more effective. So the Best Buy case, this was started back in 2004. I think there were a couple of HR employees at headquarters who really were trying to deal with some of the limitations of the accommodations that I was talking about. And so their argument is that we need to step back and think about how we're doing work, and we really need to focus much more on evaluating whether things are getting done, not whether you're here or whether I can see you or those sorts of things. But let's look at the work. Let's try and refocus attention on work itself.
I should just interject because we have an international audience. Not everybody might know what Best Buy is.
Oh, yes.
So this is right. This is retail, operation, electronics, household appliances.
Right.
Where it actually, thinking about it very simply, is a lot about people just being there, right, in order to keep things moving.
You have a lot of sales, a large sales force.
Sure, right.
So the thing that they did was to try and get groups of people, teams together, two-part process. One is to to have these kind of conversations with the team members to think about how could we do things in a way that would let us be more efficient and also then allow us to have a little more personal freedom. So fundamentally rethinking the arrangements, the work arrangements that they have. So, think about how we assign work hours. Think about...
that was employee driven?
No.
No. Okay.
This is an important part actually of both experiments.
Okay.
It was in the case of it was called results only work environment.
Yes.
Okay. Row.
Row.
So in that case, it was started by the HR, but they were very conscious of the fact that part of what's gone wrong in the accommodations arrangements, where you have to ask your supervisor if you're going to take a leave, or you have to make a deal to have flexible work arrangements.
Right.
So it's clear that it's very important to get the supervisors involved in this, that it's not something that's just imposed on them, upon them.
Yep.
So what they did was to bring together teams of employees and their supervisors, and the supervisor was responsible for helping the team come up with the ideas and to think the processes through, essentially. And then they, it was sort of, everything is fair game. Let's think about the meetings that we have. Let's think about whether we could use technology more effectively to do things rather than having all these meetings. Could we actually, if we made some kind of scheduling arrangements, could we then allow people to have more time off so that they're not having to be there constantly, just to be more effective in thinking about the arrangements for coordinating and controlling.
And you had mentioned that this is more results-oriented rather than being there for a certain amount of time. So how do you measure?
Yeah.
How do they measure performance or account for that part?
So they had to redo a lot of their performance evaluation in terms of getting people to think about, it's not just, are you there from 9 to 5, but how many customers have you actually responded to, or
right? And they can get all that data.
Yeah.
It's all available in tremendous amount of data.
This day and age,
you can GPS people through the store and transactional stuff.
And you can tell when things are, when sales are being made or not being made, or when invoices are actually filed or not filed, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it took a fair amount of training because, again, when we think about work, we have kind of standard notions of, well, you have a work schedule and you have to do things a certain way and you need to be able to monitor people to make sure they're working. So they often, particularly in the beginning, it wasn't just the manager, but also facilitators, people who are outside to help them do this. Then they launched the projects, and they, I think they had a couple of months of trying it out, and then they would reassemble, and kind of vet how's it working and recalibrate.
They would close the loop on a lot of their
so they could readjust. And it turned out it was a very effective program. I mean, the employees were incredibly enthusiastic about it. It spread to, I've forgotten, a large number of other, it started at headquarters and then it spread throughout the company, and actually a number of other organizations adopted it. It ended up they had data it reduced turnover by almost half.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of these data points here.
The employees reported that they were getting more sleep, they had more energy, they could focus better because of being able to control their work. And the thing is, so I think part of what's important here is that because people were motivated to try and think, how can I work better? Because they had the carrot at the end that your life would actually be improved. It's not like, think how to work more efficiently so you can work more often.
Right, you're not figuring out how to milk the clock. You're actually figuring out how to reduce your hours but be as effective.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Which is a big motivator to getting yourself skilled up and trained.
Right, and to, bearing in on thinking, how could I do this better? The incentives were definitely there. So it lasted for not quite 10 years. They ended it, I think, in 2014 or 2013 or 14. When a new CEO came in, the company was in some financial difficulties.
Yeah.
And this often happens. This is a problem. When somebody comes in and they feel like, oh, we need to do a turnaround, one of the first things that goes oftentimes is flexibility. I think this is partly, we talked a little bit earlier about Yahoo's case.
Yes, right.
And I'm guessing that's what went in. I mean, Mayor was brought in to do a turnaround. And so the natural impulse is, well, I want to make sure everybody's being as productive as possible. I want to see that.
Yes, that's right.
I want to physically be able to see what's going on in the company.
Right. I understand that impulse. Well, can I ask you about the Boston Consulting Group's project and how that relates?
Yeah. So it's sort of a similar kind of arrangement. Also began in 2004, and there was a woman who was on the Harvard Business School faculty that was working with them, Leslie Perlow, and they had done a big survey of employee satisfaction. And one of the issues that came up over and over and over again was this sense of unhappiness with their inability to control their schedules, and the constant unpredictability and how that had a negative effect on their workplace. And it was it was a complaint that didn't just come up among married couples or women, but it was across the board, men, women, young, old. Everybody was frustrated with the way that their life was jerked around by their work schedule, essentially.
Sure.
So the idea then was to address this problem and to make work more efficient and more effective. So again, what they did was to get the supervisors involved and to have meetings of teams, people who worked together, who needed to coordinate on a regular basis, who served different clients and so forth, with the collective goal of trying to come up with a collective goal that was of personal interest to them. So this could be, having one day a week that they knew they would get off, or half a day a week that they would get off, or even, in some cases, they were happy to work towards getting an evening off where they knew that they weren't going to have to be on call or having to respond to, crises in the organization or whatever.
Yeah.
And so they brainstormed on how they could rejigger their work arrangements to ensure that at least on a weekly basis that everybody had access to this goal, could actually touch base. So they brainstormed ways of doing this, and then they instituted this weekly, what they call a pulse check meeting. So they could kind of, again, make sure things were working, maybe do a little adapting and so forth. It's funny, when I told my husband about this, his response was, oh, great, add another meeting. But according to the author of the study, they basically just tacked on a half hour for their, to their regular weekly meeting. And again, people are motivated
That's right.
to spend the time.
That's a different type of meeting.
And the thing is, if you're planning to make yourself more efficient, then while it is a meeting, the planning may pay off
That's right.
in ways that are important.
I have a question from Andrea. This is more of an individual thing, but I'm thinking organizationally about how projects like that get kicked off. There's no easy answer to this, but Andrea asked, what are the best steps you suggest taking to advocate for yourself and encourage healthy work-life balance? And I think the idea is, how do you bring this up in your company? How do you make the case for it? No individual is alone, and this is, of course, probably desired by many people. And I'm not suggesting any unionization or any kind of class action mobilization, but how do you get, our HR people probably must be receptive to these kind of conversations.
Sure. And so this would be, a classic change initiative, and there's a lot of literature on how you go about bringing change. So one, it would require trying to get the idea into the ears of people who might be able to make it work. So you need to kind of generate a social movement in a way within the organization.
Sure.
Identify a problem, explain why it's important, create this sense of like, we're losing people, we're not going to be able to, you know,
Sure.
you have to sort of generate a rationale for why this, and then drawing on evidence from like the Rowe studies or the Boston Consulting Group study to show that actually we have evidence that these things can work. So spending time trying to get the senior members of the organization, and I think that's really important, particularly for HR people, because so often, unfortunately, in companies, people say, oh, that's HR's problem, or that's HR's project, and they don't really take it seriously. So you've really got to get buy-in from high-level people in the organization and the frontline supervisors who are going to be affected by these policies.
Yep.
So it's a real mobilization effort that's required to get it going. And you need to have some plans in place. Like, so once you get people thinking, oh yeah, this is a problem, we need to do something about it, you need to have a sort of vision that you can say, here's a solution, and try and get people involved in that. So it's the whole, I was talking about change in class the other day, so this is right at the forefront of my mind, but it's like organizing a social movement inside your organization. You've got to think strategically.
You know, I was just thinking, how about like employee satisfaction surveys? Wouldn't that be a great place to start? Because boom, then you've identified a problem that is up to upper management to fix.
Right. Well, I'm good point. You know, source of data.
How can you manage what you can't measure or whatever?
Yeah, and I would bet you could do an employee survey and you ask people, is flexibility a problem for you? You'd get a large proportion. Saying,
yeah, you can certainly make the case for that.
And that they would be willing to do that. So, you know, in the case of BC, the Boston Consulting Group, again, there was a huge uptick after the ones who participated in the program, that they were much more satisfied with their work-life balance, that they could imagine staying at the company for a long period of time. Much higher proportion of people who'd been involved in these said yes than the ones who had not. So it clearly, they make a difference in the way people feel about their work organization. And, you know, they argued that it had important effects in terms of helping people think about prioritizing tasks. I mean, the thing that's kind of interesting about this is that there's this model called agile organizations.
Sure.
Have you heard? I mean, it's a buzz term a little
done
bit.
It. Yep.
Okay, but it's basically the same thing in terms of let's rethink how we're working. Let's work together to redo that.
Yep. Intensely.
But with the aim of not just we want to work more efficiently, but we want to work more efficiently so we can have some time off.
Yeah, ultimately.
And control our lives a little better.
Right, exactly.
So I think that's really an important part of the ticket to getting this going.
Working smarter so that you don't have to work as much.
Yeah, so that you don't have to work as much, or that you can at least control. I mean, I think the problem for a lot of people, particularly in technology organizations or these kind of law firms or whatever, is not just the amount of work, but the unpredictability. That's actually worse than anything in some ways, because then you can't even schedule, like a late night meeting, because you never know whether you're meeting with your spouse. Sorry.
Yeah.
We're going to have a date, because you never know when you're going to be pulled away.
So is unpredictability a term that's kind of thrown around, like as far as people kind of expressing something that they don't like about their job? It's funny because it's not something that kind of comes up conversationally all the time, but I'm sure it's a huge deal.
It varies a lot by the type of industry that you're in. So if you're a consultant, people expect, or a lawyer, you're expected to be in firefighting mode constantly.
Yes, right.
Things come up if you're working on a case. Okay, so we need you to work through the weekend and beyond.
Yeah, right.
You hadn't planned on it. So that's clearly a problem for those workers. It may not be so much for everybody.
So what are some things that, I'm going to shift gears slightly, what are some things about people and families with dual incomes that that HR people need to be conscious of? Any particular dynamics? I know we kind of described the situation, but or we can talk about earnings as it's split up among women and men. Like we talked about something really interesting. I think it was on the phone yesterday, which is what happens when women earn more than men, right?
Yeah.
So and maybe we don't have to go so far as to say what does that mean in the workplace necessarily, but what happens at home when a woman earns more than a man?
Yeah, right. So I've done some research that looked at how kind of earnings differences between spouses affected people's sense of career satisfaction and also their family satisfaction.
Are we getting closer to an equilibrium? Where are we at with pay?
Oh, well, so
There's a gender pay gap, but
there is a gender pay gap, but it's definitely the case that the majority of dual earner families now are what they call equal earners. So each partner earning between 40 and 60% of the total family income.
Yep.
And there is a line of studies in sociology in particular that suggests there's this kind of interesting dynamic that is set in motion by spouses comparing themselves to one another in terms of how well they're doing by, who's bringing in more of the income.
Yes.
So what the work suggests is that as wives' earnings relative to their husbands go up, men start doing more of the housework until they reach a certain point. And once wives' earnings get very close to being equal, men start doing less of the housework. And the research that I did suggested part of the reason may be because when women earn more, so this has to do with how you decide if you're doing well in your job. And one person that you can kind of calibrate against is your spouse, right? Because you don't know how much everybody else is earning, but you know how much your husband or your wife is earning.
Right.
So, so when wives earnings get closer to their husbands, they get a lot more invested in their career. Their career satisfaction goes up. But their husbands' career satisfaction goes down as their wives' earnings get closer to theirs.
Sure.
And so that may be part of the reason that men start doing less housework, because they're probably working hard. Part of it may be they're working harder at their career to try it. They're thinking, I'm not doing as well as I should be. So they kick in more, and then there's less time spent at home, and and that becomes a problem actually in the workplace. It sounds like it's a problem for families if you're divorced, but all these things play out in the workplace. So it's not they're two separate spheres.
Right, there's a cause and effect.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so, the earnings thing is part of it. But I think again, this goes back to policies that somehow give people a little more control over their work, to allow them to deal with demands of family life as well as work life.
Sure. I wanted to mention, and Liz, maybe you can share this in the chat with some of the audience members. There were a couple Forbes articles that I mentioned earlier. There's just a really practical one that I thought was kind of illuminating, called All Moms Are Working Moms, and Here's How Men Can Help. And this, of course, is about both gender roles and how they can play out and how people can make things work. But I think it's interesting, certainly for the HR practitioner as well, just to understand things that can happen at home and trends and statistics around some of that stuff.
Yeah. Like I said, it's not it's not like you go to work and you go to home and never the twain shall meet. This is why work-life balance has become such an issue.
It's even kind of a strange term, as if work is not life, and conversely.
Well, that goes back to the ideal worker sort of thing. It's like
that's right.
An ideal worker does not have a home life. They are just there to work whenever you need them to.
They don't say work-life balance out loud.
Right.
So tell me about some of this info you've got up here.
So I'm actually really intrigued by those two experiments. I'm sure there are probably others that are going on, but those are ones that I'm conscious of. And I think there are a number, they differ a little on the margins, but they have some important features in common. And as I said, one of them is that they definitely emphasize the importance of getting senior members and the people who are involved in supervising the employees and evaluating their performance, involved in making the changes in the workplace, which is different from, so they, like I said, they serve as facilitators in team meetings, and they do things like, where they're actively involved in helping the team figure out how to work better, but also with the goal, not just to, so you can work more, with the goal of letting people have a little more flexibility and control of their lives. The other thing that I think is important is, and this relates to contrast with the accommodation, kind of the individual flexible work arrangements or leaves, which are all typically initiated by the employee who needs this.
Yeah.
And so it's seen as like a dispensation, a special deal for the person. And that generates, can obviously generate backlash from other employees who think, what's so special about that one? I'm not getting the same deal that they are. This is not right. And the kind of stigma that goes on. It's like, well, she needs extra support. We have to help her because clearly she's kind of hobbled. So in this case, all of the team members share the benefits. Everybody, the focus is on how can we all work together so that we all get these individual benefits. And I think that that's actually something that you need to think about, particularly if you're an HR manager, to promote policies that, are to frame them in terms of everybody benefits from this. It's not that we're trying to help some people, because that suggests some people need help, which is not good in terms of how you look. And the focus is not just on making life better for families, but it's like we can make our work better. We can be more efficient. We can do things in ways that will make us deliver the goods better and also free up people. So it's the focus on both working more efficiently, more effectively, and also recognizing that that's going to provide some benefits for the employees who are going to do this. So I think that the really interesting thing is that these kinds of experiments avoid a lot of the liabilities that often not that I'm disparaging providing leaves for families or, you do what you can. But if you really want to fundamentally address the problem of work-life balance, maybe we need to think about work-life balance for everybody, not just families, because like I said, single people face the same kind of constraints in terms of their home life, their personal life.
That's exactly it, right.
So it's, And then, we could always, this gets us further afield. This gets us out of the immediate, but national policies. These are things that companies can do to fix, but maybe it's time to kind of revisit how we think about the legal structures. And, these are things that went back, the NLRA, National Labor Relations Act, a lot of the workplace practices and policies are shaped by laws that were passed in the 30s and 40s. And clearly, families, the world, technology, all kinds of things have changed since then.
Yes.
So many countries are much more advanced than the U.S. in terms of leave policies and those sorts of things about integrating work life. Maybe it's time for us to do that here in the U.S. It's interesting. Keyes, who's a famous economist back in the 1930s, right, made the argument that made the prediction that within 100 years, the average work week would be 15 hours a week, because he thought with technology and with the kind of changes, we're actually going kind of in the opposite direction.
Right. Despite what Tim Ferriss's book says, right? What was he, the 12-hour work week or something?
Oh, I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Oh, boy. Yeah. Okay, anyway.
So it may be time in this country to rethink, to look at other again, it doesn't seem like a political environment that may be conducive to that, but the environments change. And I think that it would be a useful goal for us to kind of think about, imagine change. We have a normal work week of 40 hours. What if we pushed that to 35 hours a week and we got rid of policies that said some employees are exempt from this? So some employees can work extra long hours without getting paid anything else.
Yeah.
I think that would be the thing that would be interesting about that is it might encourage employers to spread the work around a little more. One of the things that has gone along with this long hour workers is that we also have a big segment of the workforce that is underworking, that is working less than 30 hours a week, and they don't want to.
That's right.
They would be happy to work full time.
Yeah, underemployment is a big deal.
So you could, with the national policy, you could kind of provide incentives for employers to spread the work out a little bit more. Everybody would benefit, including families and all kinds of things. So, so that's one direction that things could go. We also have model organizations to provide kind of pathways. And I mentioned the SAS Corporation. There is a case study from, I think it's in the Harvard. But anyway, it's about this big data analytics company, which has been around since, 1976 maybe. It's a successful company, always done well. This is the one where they have a 35-hour work week policy, although people are also expected, if you're needed, you will be there. But the norm, you have a norm that work is not supposed to wake up every day of your life. They provide childcare policies. It's a very employee-centered company. And the case makes it sound like, Shangri-La. But the thing is that it's a private company. And I think it's easier to do that than in a public company, because in a public company, you start getting pressures from stockholders to, cut out the fat and make it run more effectively.
Got it, yeah.
But it is a private company, but it's been incredibly, it's had like a 10% sales growth on average every year since it was founded.
Okay.
Clearly, it's succeeding.
Yes.
It's not like, the fat is somehow being, quote unquote, fat is being wasted.
That's right.
So that's a possibility. In the long run, though, that's much further away. I think for now, we'd be better off trying to encourage the companies that we work for. And again, HR can play an important role here, clearly.
Yes.
You've got to hook in the people who are not in HR. You can't make it an HR sort of project. You've got to get it spread throughout the company. But HR has historically been sort of the champion of these kinds of initiatives.
Right, and that's what we've seen in a couple of these cases where, certainly HR has a different function these days than it used to, right? I mean, just broadly speaking, HR historically is being thought of as a transactional type part of the organization, but now clearly, and this is a theme that keeps coming up in these webcasts, is HR needs to be driving this, but also working with all sectors of the organization. And I think what's been nice about this talk is you've offered us some historical perspective and an analysis, a diagnosis of where we're at, and of course offered some cool, viable solutions. And hopefully we've introduced the audience to some different ways of thinking about this entirely, and hopefully we've spurred some creativity. I want to thank all of you for hanging out today and joining us. I do want, Liz, if you could share one other article, because there are a lot of ideas that are a little bit more prescriptive in the second article from Shelley Zalis that I found in Forbes, Lessons from the World's Most Gender Equal Countries. Kind of some mind-blowing stuff. We said earlier that it's kind of no surprise that the most progressive and in many cases effective initiatives are coming from Scandinavian countries, and they seem to have a good deal of this pretty well dialed.
Well,
imperfect, I know.
So just one kind of last note on that.
Yeah.
In a lot of the Scandinavian countries and in Germany and others, the thing that interests me is that it's really family focused. It's not gender-based. It's not, I mean, and in fact, the policies have been tweaked so that we're supporting families as a whole, so that it's not just the wives taking off, taking these generous leaves and then getting set back in their career. So I think really keeping the focus on both men and women, and
how does that manifest itself in terms of like actual policy? What do these companies do to actually support families? Or what's the thinking behind it?
I was going to say, well, in Germany, they actually require, if there's going to be family leave, you have to, both members of the couple have to take some of the time off.
Okay,
it can't
right.
just
I've
all
heard
be.
that. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So
well, that's pretty interesting, and I'd love hearing. We were talking about my friend in Finland, where they each parent got something like 2.5 years, right? Guaranteed job, and after all that, you've got a well-nourished 5-year-old.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And that's going to make the rest of your life, especially even as a worker, that much better.
And it makes a difference for the companies, because you've got
that's
to work.
what I mean. Yeah.
You've got a workforce that you've got workers who can work, and you've got a future workforce that is not, kind of been left to fend for itself
Right.
in growing up.
Yeah, exactly.
So, So I think that the thinking about work and family as kind of integrated whole is an important thing for policy, and even for national policy, but also for company policy.
Perfect. Well, thank you. It's been a really nice conversation today.
It's been fun.
We're running up against the clock. We're near the end of the hour. Again, thank you, audience, for coming. Thanks to Pamela Tolbert from the ILR School at Cornell University. As I mentioned before, there's a quiz and assessment that you can take after this, and you can earn 0.1 continuing education unit credits from Cornell University. So hang out, return back to the Connect window from whence you came, and we'll launch the quiz there. And I want to thank all of you for coming today. Thanks again, Pam.
Thank you.
See you everybody next time.